Hi, welcome to another Falcon 4 BMS tutorial. This tutorial is going to be on the ILS system, also known as the Instrument Landing System. And before we jump in game, we need to go over some basic concepts behind ILS. This is not going to be a lengthy lecture or anything like that. It's just going to be a few images and a very brief introduction to what we're dealing with. This way you have a point of reference once we get in game. Now that being said, ILS is a radio navigation aid that allows a pilot to make a landing without having visual on the runway. And the way this is done is a series of radio towers are transmitting navigation cues to the aircraft. And there's two types of different forms of guidance. Or two elements to an ILS-based guidance system. There's the localizer, and there is the glide slope. And these are two different things that are being transmitted to the aircraft by various radio towers as they approach the runway. The glide slope is this vertical column here, and it's guidance for the pitch of the aircraft. And the localizer is lateral guidance, and that's represented here by this rectangular horizontal box. So when these two cues come together, it allows you to, make a precise landing based upon the attitude and the inclination of your aircraft. And it's really useful for when you want to do a landing in really bad weather, or it's also useful just for general navigation. And for someone who's new to doing landings, it can be pretty useful. And speaking of doing landings, this video will also have just a tutorial on how to do a landing, because I think that's why some people were demanding this, is because they don't really know how to do a landing. So I'm going to just do, at the end of this video, there'll be a section on how to do a regular landing without ILS. So if you want that, go to the table of contents below, just jump to that right now. If not, continue watching and we'll go over ILS. So I'm just going to run through some more images. So the idea here is that the ILS system is sort of creating this cone that you have to fly within. You have to fly within the parameters of this cone in order to make the landing. And the cone has a physical topology, so it moves, or rather it doesn't move, but it's a pre-planned route that your aircraft has to fly, sort of like riding a rope or a radar beam. You have to sort of follow it. And as you follow it, it will continue to give you more and more information so that you make corrections and finally land the way you want. And here's another image, just sort of also showing this idea that you're flying into a cone, and the cone gets thinner and thinner until you terminate on the runway. Okay, here's a final image, and this is also showing sort of physical topology of the ILS system and the approach. You can see here that this aircraft has been instructed to follow this straight line, and then it sort of goes down as you approach a certain threshold, and the cone gets thinner and thinner until you end up on the runway. And it also has an abort heading all the way at the terminating end of it. So that's the theoretical basis of ILS. If you want to know more about it, the theory of it, I highly recommend going to Wikipedia. I really tried to simplify this way people don't get bored and turn this off. That's the basic theory behind it. Now, in order to use ILS navigation in the game, we need to supply the aircraft with the unique ILS frequency and course heading for the runway we want to land at. So the basic theory here is that each ILS enabled runway has a unique transmitting frequency, and that has to be entered into the aircraft. And we're going to go in game. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. But before we go in game, we have to get that frequency. We have to get that runway heading. We can't do that from in the game. So this is one limitation of BMS as opposed to Allied Force or the original Falcon 4, is that you'd have like a kneeboard in the game. You'd get your ILS information out of there, the course heading, you could do it on the fly. But kneeboards don't exist in BMS, at least not at this point. So before we even get in game, we have to get that stuff. So where do you get it from? Well, there's a few places, okay? The most common place is in the BMS folder. Right now I'm in the BMS folder. I go to Docs, then I go to Airport Approach and Navigation Charts, then I select the area or region that I want to get the ILS for, so we'll go to South Korea, and then it has a listing of all the different runways, and each one of these folders has ILS, TACAN, and airport diagram, images inside of them. So we'll go ahead and select Kimpo, and you'll see in here that there's a variety of images. This image is a airport diagram for Kimpo. Not really useful for ILS per se. And then we have some Kimpo departure. This is like a pre-planned departure route for Kimpo. Now this is getting interesting. This is the ILS departure plan and arrival plan for runway 14 left. Okay, and this is actually has the information that we need. Okay, it has at the top here. It has some really good information. It has a TACAN frequency, which we're not going to need because we're using ILS. The tower frequencies. Then right here, this is the key. It has the ILS frequency. You got to copy that down. Okay. It also has where it says LOC. This is the heading of the runway. Okay. So we got to copy the ILS frequency and the heading of the runway. It also tells you the GPS location of it, the elevation, and this is like it also shows you the approach that you should make for an ideal approach. In reality, in real aviation, pilots will always fly pre-planned approaches. They don't just take off and fly wherever they want or land however they want. It's all done by these pre-planned approaches. So that's what this image is showing you. It's showing you how to do a pre-planned approach. And it also has, I'm not going to go over all of this because I doubt any of you will do this, and I don't even do it. So, but what you do need to know is where to get the ILS frequency and the heading. And down here, this image at the bottom is pretty useful. It shows you the elevation and range at which point the ILS will be accessible to your aircraft. And as a rule of thumb, ILS information will usually be available about 18 or 19 miles away from the airfield. And the ILS localizer beam and the glide slope beam usually start off at about 2,000 feet. And you can usually get guidance higher up than that, but in order to do a landing, you usually need to get down to 2,000. And we can see here just the pre-planned route. You start off at 4,000, all the way over here. Start off at 4,000 feet where that star is at DME 31. Head northeast to DME 14, which is, and then you slowly descend to 2,000 and then hit the ILS and follow the ILS for continued guidance. It also shows you the ILS on the actual big image. That's this sort of arrow head above the airfield to the northwest. Now, you could get your information in this way, but I find it to be very tedious. I personally don't use it. Another source is in this file here. This is back in the Airport Approach and Navigation Charts folder. There is a PDF called Korean Volume BMS 1002.pdf. Okay? And this file contains a table which has all the approach information that you need for the various air bases in South Korea. So we have the listing of air bases here on the left. There are tower frequencies, the TACAN channel, TACAN range. Now, for our purposes, what's important is the ILS, okay, the ILS frequency and its associated runway, what the associated runway that the ILS frequency is attached to. So we can see the top one here. This is Cheongju and the ILS is 111.7, and that's for runway 23 right. And of course, we find our friend Kimpo here. And Kimpo has 4 different ILS frequencies for 4 different runways and approaches. That's because each different approach must have a unique frequency because it gives unique guidance information. So we can approach the runway from the north at runway 14 left or 14 right, and there's 2 different frequencies for either one of those approaches. And then there's also 2 different frequencies for the 2 southern approaches. So you need to have, you need to copy this down now, copy down the ILS frequency. You can print this thing out, probably come in use. I personally, don't use this, and I also don't use the images that are in the folders. What I use is a fan-made interactive website that has all the navigation information on it and is actually a lot easier to use. So I'm going to give you guys a link to this in the video description, but this is an interactive map of Korea, and you can click on any of these air bases and then it will show you the same information that's on the images, except it's more interactive and you can copy it and you can send links to your friends, and it's a lot better to use. So I'm just going to zoom in here by just holding down control and scrolling on my mouse wheel. This isn't like a feature of the website or anything, it's just me using Firefox. And we can see here Kimpo, just south of Seoul. I'm going to click on that. And then we see it has the same information that was on that navigation chart. It has GPS, elevation, the runways, the TACAN, tower frequencies. Oh, and what is this down here? This is the important stuff, okay? It's got all the runways with their ILS frequencies and the course heading for the runway. So we see here our good friend 14 left, 109.9, 144. Now that's all you need to do an ILS approach. So if you just want to do it dirty style and do it by ear, that's all you need is those 2 pieces of information. But if you do want to follow the pre-planned approach and make like a textbook landing, you can still access the navigation charts from this website. This is the exact same image that is in the BMS folder. Okay, so we're now in game. We know what runway we want to land at. We know the runway heading, and we know the ILS frequency. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to where our HSI is. To the left of our HSI is this knob. Okay, this knob selects the navigation mode that the F-16 is in. So by default it's on nav. We're going to left click and switch it to ILS/nav. Then we're going to go up and check out the HUD. So the first thing you're going to notice is that right above the Mach indicator it's going to say ILS. And we're also going to have a cross on our flight path marker. We're going to go over what that cross means in a moment. But for now we need to enter the frequency for the ILS, and we also need to enter the runway heading. So we're going to click 1 on our ICP. And then we'll see these green asterisks in a space. That's for the frequency. We're going to go ahead and enter in 1099 and then enter. And the runway heading is then where it says cruise CRS. We're going to enter the runway heading right there, 144, and then enter. So we're now good to go. What you need to realize though is that we're not going to receive any ILS guidance whatsoever until we're at about 18 or 19 miles. So right now we're 26 miles away from home plate. We can very, very faintly see it to our 1 o'clock. You see the threshold of the runway. We're going to need to get a little bit closer, and then when we get closer we'll start to get some initial guidance. Okay, so we're now in game. We're going to do an ILS approach. Before we do that though, we're going to go over the basic HUD symbology of this cross. Okay, so this vertical line is the localizer line. It's that lateral guidance that I was referring to in the earlier part of this video. Okay, The horizontal line is the glide slope guidance. When either of these lines becomes solid, then you have valid guidance. Okay, so right now, neither is valid, and that is because, as I've gone over before, we're too far from the airbase in order to get guidance. When we get within about 18 or 19 miles, 18.8 to be exact, the localizer will become solid, and we'll also get some command steering cues. And from there, we'll get more and more guidance until we have full guidance, including pitch guidance and some steering cues, and then we'll line up on the runway and land. That being said, let's go ahead and unpause the game. I'm going to reference the home plate. We can see the runway to my 12 o'clock. It's about 22 miles out. I'm going to start flying a general intercept. Right now I have no ILS guidance. I know the final heading for the runway is 144. You shoot for that. Okay, we now see we're now about 18.8 miles. The cross has no longer snapped onto my flight path marker, and the reason for that is now that we actually have some data, and it's no longer just arbitrarily centered there. We also see on the top of our artificial horizon we have a small circle, and that's the command steering cue. Now, if I were to put my flight path marker on that command steering cue, we should intercept the localizer and roll into that ILS cone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up generally on that heading of that command steering cue, but I'm also going to be dropping some altitude because we're too high for a landing. You see the airfield to my 10 o'clock. We're about 17 miles out.
In position.
We can also see that the localizer is solid.
Altitude. Altitude.
And when we get a little bit closer, we're going to intercept the localizer fully, and then we're going to see the localizer sort of come to life. It's going to start shifting to the left. It's going to guide us on to the final approach. Got to be at about 2,000 feet in order to get full guidance. The runway is now to my 10 o'clock, almost 9 o'clock. We see the command steering cue move to the left as we come onto the into the cone. Also, the localizer shifting to the left. Keep the flight path marker on the localizer. Almost on final. Should begin to get pitch guidance shortly. 7 miles out. You hear those tones? Those are the ILS beacons. There's middle, outer, and inner beacons. Okay, now what we've fully intercepted the glide slope. We have, it's hard to see because it's a little cluttered, but the glide slope guidance marker has become solid. We also have a new indicator next to our flight path marker. It's a upright circle. It's a circle with an upright line with an X on it. Okay. This is the command steering cue. It's jumped from the artificial horizon to next to the flight path marker in the ILS. Pretty much all we need to do now to fly onto this final heading is we just need to put the flight path marker on that cue, and then it will line up everything perfectly for us. So I'm going to unpause the game. I'm going to put my gear down, and I'm going to put the meatball onto that cue. And by the way, if you were to fly a pre-planned approach, you wouldn't have to do any of this jinking. You could just fly it, and it would be pretty much centered the entire time. Now we can see everything's lined up. This is ideal. And as we approach, we're gonna want to put our meatball onto the 3-degree nose down line. And I'm gonna go over how to do a basic landing in the end of this video. We're on final now. Okay, now the next thing we're going to go over in the video is really the most practical application of ILS, and that is doing an ILS landing in horrible conditions. Right now, you can barely see anything. There's a very thick cloud layer below me, but there is a massive storm brewing under this cloud layer. And with almost no visibility. I'm going to use ILS to get onto the runway and to land safely. Drop altitude, and this is really where your HSD and your flight plan really becomes important. It's less important when you can visually see the runway, but it's very important in these sort of conditions, because when you're outside of ILS range, you still need to guide this thing so it can be with so you're relatively lined up in a reasonable manner. In order to do that, you're going to have to just look at your flight plan and just approximate it until you're within ILS range, at which point you can get some more precise guidance. Okay, so we now have some ILS.
Altitude. Altitude.
We're at about 9,000 feet. Look at that command steering cue. Fly intercept. And the runway should be about my 10 o'clock right now, about 16 miles. We're still above the cloud layer. We're going to go under in a moment. Be at my 10 o'clock according to the flight plan, at 14 miles. Okay, we're now under the cloud layer. You can see that there's a really nasty storm here. There's rain flying past the canopy. I should actually pay attention to my landing. We're at about 6,000 feet. You can barely see anything. There's about 3 or 4 mile visibility here. The runway is now to my about 10 o'clock still. We're about 5,000 feet. Command steering cue starting to move to the left. Follow it in. Drop some altitude. See now that we have localizer guidance, just like before. Runway. Okay, I got the glide slope. I'm going to move my flight marker onto the command steering queue now. We're about 8 miles out. Gear down. Now at this point I can see the runway lights, and this is pretty much the entire purpose of ILS, just to get you so you can visually see it. At this point, if I wanted to, I could just, terminate the ILS landing and just land visually. Because by the time I get there, I'm going to be able to see the runway. There are going to be times when you're not going to have that luxury. You're not going to have the luxury of being able to see the runway at all. Maybe the visibility would be even worse than in this situation. At which case, you'd have to fly ILS the entire way, even to touchdown. So now we have full guidance. This is optimal. Coming in a little slow. I'm just going to increase the power a bit. A little bit of a crosswind due to the storm. For the threshold here. At this point, visually land it. And we're on the ground. So that's how to use ILS to land in horrible conditions. You can see there's still a storm rolling past our screen. You stop, you can see the rain pooling. And you can use ILS to land in even worse conditions. It's, 100-foot, 200-foot visibility. You can use ILS to touch down on the runway using no visual at all. Now the next part of this video is a general tutorial on landing. And there's a few basic concepts that you need to know in order to do a good landing. Number one is, when you touch down, you want to be below 200 knots, preferably between 180 and 190 knots. The second thing is, you're going to want to touch down with 3 degrees down, 3 degrees nose down. The third thing is, you're going to want to land on the threshold at the beginning of the runway. Now, how we're going to land right now, it's going to be pretty unrealistic, because we're just going to visually guide ourselves in and just land sort of based on our intuition. And as I went over before, realistically, we'd be approaching in a pre-brief pattern, and everyone would be approaching and taking off in the same way. This way to minimize or completely eliminate collision risk. But the way we're going to do this now is we're just going to land it the way most of you guys will probably land, which is you just feel it and then you land. So right now I have the runway to my 10 o'clock. And I'm just going to pause this. We're going to take a look at the runway. So, actually, let's get some altitude first, or at least turn, so you can see the runway a little better. Whatever. So the runway is to my 10 o'clock. What I want to do is, I want to turn left onto the runway when it's approximately to my 9 o'clock, but not quite my 9 o'clock, because otherwise I'll overshoot it. So I basically have to fly intercept on the runway, but I don't want to do it too late, otherwise I'll overshoot the runway. And of course you can make corrections, it's not life or death, but normally you want to be ideal. And another note on speed is that you're not going to want to bring down your gear until you're below 300 knots. Otherwise, your gear can be damaged or even rip off.
2 in position.
Now we're dropping altitude. Our final landing approach, 2,000, 3,000 feet is good. the runway's at my 10 o'clock right now. Once it's to my almost 9 o'clock, like, 9:30 o'clock, then we're going to turn left and align ourselves off the runway. And the basic idea is we're going to put our meatball on the 3 degrees nose down mark, and we're going to put that also on the threshold of the runway. Okay, cool. Now from this range we can actually see what I wanted to show you before. Now let's talk about, actually, can we? Okay, yeah, let's talk about the basic anatomy of a runway, okay? So at the beginning of the runway you have these white boxes, okay? Right at the end of the runway. That's called the threshold, and that's where you're going to want to put down your gear. The reason for that is, realistically, is that only certain sections of the runway are reinforced enough to absorb the shock of a landing. And also, the secondary thing is that if you land ahead of the threshold, there's no real guarantee that you'll roll to a stop in time. Okay, I'm now going to turn left visually onto the runway. I'm going to line myself up. Gear down. I'm at 275 knots, so it's nice and safe. Now we can see here. Now, like I said, you want to, when you touch down, you want to be 3 degrees nose down. Okay, that's ideal for the gear. And we have a visual guide when we bring our gear down. Right here, between the 5 degrees nose down and the artificial horizon, this new HUD symbology occurs. It's these dashed lines. Okay, and that's indicating 3 degrees nose down. So now I have a visual guide, so I don't have to be looking down here to see if I'm 3 degrees nose down. I can just look at my HUD, and all is good. We're about 7 miles out. We're on. This is called final. Okay, final approach. Just try to visually line up with the runway. About 2,000 plus 7 right now. 240 knots. We're a little bit too fast to touch down, but that's fine because we still have some room. Now we see the threshold more closely. I want that meatball on the threshold, but I also want to be 3 degrees nose down. If I'm 5 degrees nose down, then my gear are going to snap. These skills translate to ILS too, because, like I said before, ILS is just to get you to a terminal state of landing, and then you're going to terminate the landing yourself. Now, right now, we can see the 3 degree mark is still too high up, so I'm going to nose down a bit to lose some altitude, and then we're going to see it's going to come down. I also need to lose a little bit of airspeed. I'm a little too fast. Like I said, I want to touch down at 180 to 190 knots. We're about 3,000 feet away now. I'm going to put that, I'm going to nose up a little bit and get that flight path marker on the 3 degrees nose down line. Anywhere on these white boxes is fine. Just hold it now and hold it. And we're down. Now you hold down K to apply brakes. Don't do it if you came in above 200. Do not use your brakes. Let it roll out first. But if you came in below 200 like I did, go ahead and apply brakes now. Just hold down K. If you start veering off course, you can use your rudder to make corrections. Roll to a stop, and when your flight path when your flight speed indicator on the HUD is below when it's 0, then you can apply nose wheel steering by pressing shift /. Now I can basically drive this thing like a car by using the rudder. You can use rudder inputs with nose wheel steering off, but it's not as sensitive, and you really have to put a lot of rudder in. So with the nose wheel steering enabled, I can now make wide turns. I can basically drive this thing as if you would your Toyota. I can go visit the airport here. You know, go kick my cockpit up and act like I'm big dick on base and do other fun things. So that's my ILS and landing tutorial. I know I abbreviated quite a bit, and the reason for that is that I know a lot of people are not interested in, you know, instrument flight rules. For instance, I mean, I didn't go over how you can use the HSI and your instruments here to do a landing using ILS. I know many of you are not interested in that, but it is something that you should learn if you really want to master the game. And I highly recommend reading the manual. There's a great example in there of some imagery showing you like an example landing of ILS, and it walks through how the HUD transitions from phase to phase. I highly recommend checking out the BMS manual. And I'm also going to provide a link in the description for the navigation website that I mentioned before. So please check that out. Please leave comments if you have any feedback. Thank you.